In 1953, Iran had a democratically elected government. Its people had chosen a leader who promised independence, prosperity, and dignity. But the United States and Britain decided democracy in Iran was dangerous, not because it threatened freedom, but because it threatened oil profits. So they overthrew the government, reinstalled a monarch, and unleashed decades of dictatorship, torture, and repression. The scars of that decision still define Iran today. This is the story of how colonial powers crushed Iranian democracy, extracted its resources, and left behind a legacy of suffering. Mohammad Mossadegh became Iran's prime minister in 1951. He was enormously popular, known for his integrity and his nationalism. Above all, he was determined to end foreign domination of Iran's oil. Since the early 1900s, Iran's petroleum had been controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the ancestor of today's BP. The deal was brutally unfair. Britain took nearly all the profits, while Iranians worked in poverty, watching their country's wealth fuel the British economy. Workers lived in slums without running water, while executives enjoyed lush compounds with swimming pools and manicured lawns. Mossadegh promised to change that. In 1951, with overwhelming support in parliament, he nationalized Iran's oil industry. For the first time, Iranians would control their own resources. To ordinary people, it was a moment of pride. But in London, it was viewed as an unforgivable act of defiance. Britain responded with fury. They imposed an embargo, blocking Iranian oil from reaching world markets. Tankers that tried to carry Iranian crude were turned away. Britain froze Iranian assets and began plotting in secret. But Britain alone could not topple Mossadegh. After World War II, it had neither the money nor the military reach, so they turned to Washington. The Cold War provided the excuse. Though Mossadegh was not a communist, the US feared his defiance might push Iran closer to the Soviet Union. To American leaders, any independent nationalism in the Middle East was a threat, and so Britain's MI6 and America's CIA joined forces in what became Operation Ajax. The plan was textbook regime change. First, propaganda. The CIA paid newspapers to publish fake stories claiming Mossadegh was corrupt, unstable, and secretly pro-Soviet. Next, political manipulation. CIA officers funneled cash to Iranian politicians and clerics willing to denounce Mossadegh. Then, street power. Agents paid gangs and strongmen to stage riots, attacking mosques and symbols of authority to create chaos. Finally, the military was bribed. Key generals were promised money and support if they turned against the prime minister. In August 1953, the coup was launched. At first, it faltered. Mossadegh remained in power and even considered arresting the Shah, Iran's monarch, who had fled the country. But with more CIA money flooding Tehran, mobs took to the streets again. This time, the military joined them. Tanks rolled into the capital. Mossadegh's home was shelled, and he was arrested. The Shah returned in triumph, not as a constitutional monarch, but as an absolute ruler, backed by foreign powers. Mossadegh was put on trial, convicted of treason, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Democracy in Iran had lasted barely 2 years before being strangled by Anglo-American intervention. The rewards for the West were immediate. Oil concessions were divided between British and American companies. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company regained access, joined now by US firms that had previously been excluded. The people of Iran, once promised control of their own resources, were again locked out of the wealth beneath their feet. For Iranians, the consequences were devastating. The Shah's regime quickly built a secret police force known as SAVAK, trained by the CIA and Israel's Mossad. SAVAK became infamous for its torture chambers, surveillance, and suppression of dissent. Opposition parties were banned, newspapers censored, and thousands of Iranians jailed or killed for criticizing the monarchy. What began as a corporate quarrel over oil profits ended as decades of dictatorship for millions of people. Washington called it a victory for freedom, but for Iranians, it meant freedom had been stolen. The coup planted seeds of resentment that never went away. By the 1970s, anger against the Shah's repression boiled over into revolution. In 1979, the Iranian people rose up, toppling the monarchy. But because democracy had been poisoned decades earlier, the revolution did not restore it. Instead, it opened the door for a theocracy, ruled by clerics who promised to resist foreign domination but imposed their own authoritarian system. When Americans today ask, "Why does Iran hate us?" the answer begins in 1953. Iranians remember that when they tried democracy, the West destroyed it. They remember that their oil was stolen, their leaders smeared, their freedom crushed. The story of Operation Ajax is not just about Iran. It is about a pattern: colonial powers crushing independence movements wherever they threatened Western profits. It happened in Guatemala, in Congo, in Chile, and many more. But in Iran, the wound is still open. 70 years later, the coup remains one of the clearest examples of how colonialism adapts. No longer flags and armies, but covert operations, propaganda, propaganda, and corporations, all to ensure that wealth continues flowing out of the global south and into Western capitals. The coup against Mohammad Mossadegh reminds us that the fight for sovereignty is never just about borders. It is about dignity, resources, and the right of a people to determine their own future, and it is about the devastating consequences when that right is stolen in the name of empire.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more deep dives into the world's incredible histories.